I became his wife on a Thursday afternoon, beneath a sky the color of old pewter. And even as he placed the ring upon my finger, I knew I was marrying a man who still belonged to someone else. What I did not know, what I could not have fathomed, was that she had not yet finished belonging to him. My name is Eleanor Ashford, or rather, it was Eleanor Ashford until that gray December day in 1871 when I became Lady Hale, mistress of Thornbury Hall, and second wife to a man whose first wife had been dead for nearly 2 years. I was 26 years old, considered rather past the bloom of marriageable youth by the standards of our unforgiving society, and I had accepted Simon's proposal with the quiet pragmatism of a woman who understood that love, like so many beautiful things, was not always meant for everyone. Simon Hale was not unkind. I want to make that clear from the very beginning, for what followed might otherwise paint him in shadows he did not deserve. He was a man of 34, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples and eyes the color of rain-washed slate. When he looked at me, which was not often in those early days, there was a politeness in his gaze, a careful courtesy, as though he were handling something fragile and feared he might break it. I did not mistake this gentleness for love. I was not so foolish, but I thought, in time, that we might build something resembling contentment. I thought that I could be enough. The carriage ride from the church to Thornbury Hall took nearly an hour, and Simon sat across from me in silence, watching the Yorkshire moors roll past the window like a sea of brown and purple waves frozen in time. I studied his profile when I thought he was not looking, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that seemed permanently etched there, as though he carried some invisible weight upon his shoulders that never quite lifted. I wanted to reach across the space between us and touch his hand, to offer some word of comfort or connection, but I did not know how. We were strangers, he and I, bound now by law and God and the exchange of vows, yet strangers still. Thornbury Hall revealed itself as we crested a small hill, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was magnificent and melancholy in equal measure, a sprawling estate of gray stone and climbing ivy, with tall windows that glinted like watchful eyes in the fading afternoon light. The gardens I could see even from the carriage had been left to grow somewhat wild, roses tangling with hedgerows, pathways disappearing beneath carpets of fallen leaves. There was beauty here, but it was the beauty of something neglected, something waiting. The staff had assembled in the entrance hall to greet us, a row of faces I did not yet know, names I would learn in the days to come. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and eyes that assessed me with a measuring look I could not quite interpret. She curtsied and welcomed me as Lady Hale, and the title felt strange upon my ears, as though I were wearing a garment that had been tailored for someone else. Simon showed me to my rooms himself, leading me up the grand staircase with its carved banister and portraits of Hale ancestors watching our ascent with painted disapproval. My chambers were in the east wing, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and pale green, with tall windows overlooking the gardens, and a fireplace where a cheerful blaze already crackled. It was lovely, truly, and I told him so. He nodded, accepting the compliment with that same careful courtesy, and then he paused at the door. "I should tell you," he said, his voice low and somewhat strained, "that Isabel's rooms were in the west wing. I have kept them closed. I hope you understand." I told him that I did, though in truth I understood very little. I knew only the barest facts about his first wife, Isabel Hale, née Whitmore, a woman of great beauty and delicate constitution who had died of a sudden fever 2 winters past. Society had whispered, as society always does, about the depth of Simon's grief, about the way he had withdrawn from London entirely after her death, about the black he still wore even now, 18 months later. I had heard that he had loved her desperately, devotedly, in a way that men of his station rarely loved their wives, and I had accepted his proposal knowing all of this, believing that I could live in the long shadow she had left behind. That first evening, we dined together in the vast dining room, seated at opposite ends of a table that could have accommodated 20 guests. The candles flickered between us, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and we spoke of small things, safe things, the journey, the weather, the plans for the household. Simon asked about my family, and I told him about my father, a country parson who had died when I was 19, and my mother, who had followed him 3 years later, leaving me in the care of a distant aunt who had made it clear that my presence was a burden she bore only out of Christian duty. I did not tell him how lonely those years had been, how I had learned to make myself small and useful and undemanding, how I had nearly given up hope of ever having a home of my own. Some truths are too tender to speak aloud to strangers, even strangers who are now your husband. After dinner, Simon excused himself, saying he had correspondence to attend to in his study. I wandered the halls of Thornbury alone, learning the shape of my new home, trailing my fingers along wallpaper and wooden panels, pausing before paintings and porcelain vases. The house was beautiful but cold, not in temperature, but in feeling, as though it had been holding its breath for a very long time, waiting for something or someone. I found myself standing before a closed door in the west wing without quite knowing how I had gotten there. The corridor here was darker, the gas lamps fewer, and there was a stillness in the air that felt different from the rest of the house. I knew, without anyone telling me, that this was the entrance to Isabel's rooms. I could feel it somehow, the way one feels the presence of deep water beneath thin ice. I did not try the handle. I did not dare. But I stood there for a long moment, my heart beating a strange rhythm in my chest, and I whispered, without knowing why, "I mean no harm. I only want to belong here." The silence that answered me was absolute. I retired to my chambers and sat before the vanity mirror while my new lady's maid, a quiet girl named Agnes, unpinned my hair. The face that looked back at me was unremarkable, I thought. A face of pleasant features, but no particular beauty, brown eyes and brown hair, and a complexion that was neither fashionably pale nor unfashionably ruddy. I was ordinary. That was the word that had followed me all my life. Ordinary Eleanor, who would make some ordinary man a perfectly ordinary wife. But I had not married an ordinary man. I had married a man who still dreamed of another woman, and as Agnes brushed out my hair with long, soothing strokes, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. Sleep came reluctantly that night, and when it did, it brought strange dreams. I dreamed of a woman standing at the end of a long corridor, her back to me, her pale hair falling loose around her shoulders. She wore a dress the color of a summer sky, and when I called out to her, she began to turn, slowly, so slowly, but before I could see her face, I woke. The room was cold, the fire had died to embers, and the darkness pressed against the windows like something alive. I lay still, my breath misting faintly in the air, and I listened. There was nothing to hear, no sound but the settling of the old house around me, and yet I felt certain, with a certainty I could not explain, that I was not alone. I did not sleep again until dawn. The next morning I woke to pale winter sunlight and the smell of tea and toast that Agnes brought on a silver tray. The strangeness of the night seemed distant, almost imagined, and I chided myself for allowing an unfamiliar house and an overactive imagination to disturb my rest. I was a practical woman. I had always prided myself on that. I dressed and went downstairs, determined to begin my duties as mistress of Thornbury Hall. There was much to learn, accounts to review, menus to approve, staff to meet properly. Mrs. Pemberton walked me through the house, explaining its rhythms and routines with that same assessing look, and I tried my best to appear competent and confident, though I felt neither. I did not see Simon until luncheon, and even then our conversation was brief. He seemed distracted, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, and I found myself wondering what occupied his mind so completely. Was it Isabel Always Isabel, the ghost of the woman he had loved and lost? Or was it something else entirely, some burden he carried that I knew nothing about? That afternoon, I took a walk in the gardens despite the chill. I needed air, needed space, needed a moment away from the weight of the house and all its unspoken histories. The paths were overgrown, as I had noticed from the carriage, but there was a wild beauty to the neglect, roses gone to hip, lavender dried on the stem, ivy claiming the garden walls inch by inch. I found a bench beneath an old oak tree and sat there for a long while, watching the clouds move across the sky like ships on a gray sea. When I returned to the house, the light was beginning to fade, and I saw something that stopped me where I stood. Simon was in the conservatory, the glass-walled room at the back of the house where tropical plants had once grown but now stood mostly empty, their pots filled with dry earth and brittle stems. He had built a fire in the small iron stove that heated the space, and he was feeding something into the flames, something blue, something silk. I moved closer, drawn by a compulsion I did not understand, and pressed myself into the shadow of the doorway. From there, I could see clearly. He held a gown in his hands, a beautiful gown of pale blue silk with delicate lace at the bodice, and he was pushing it into the fire, section by section, watching the fabric catch and curl and blacken. His face, lit by the flames, was a mask of anguish. There were tears on his cheeks. His lips moved, forming words I could not hear, and his hands trembled as he fed the last of the silk to the hungry fire. I watched until it was done, until there was nothing left but ash and the bitter smell of burnt fabric, and then I crept away before he could know I had seen. My heart was pounding, my thoughts in chaos. Why had he burned the dress? Whose dress had it been? But I knew, even as I asked myself the question. I knew it had been hers, Isabel's. I did not go down to dinner that evening. I sent word through Agnes that I was feeling unwell, a headache, nothing serious, and I stayed in my room with the curtains drawn and the fire blazing. I could not face Simon, not yet, not with the image of his tear-streaked face still burning behind my eyes. I did not know what to feel. Pity, perhaps, for a man still so consumed by grief. Or jealousy, that ugly emotion I had tried so hard to suppress at the depth of a love I would never inspire. Or fear, perhaps, the faintest thread of fear, that I had married into something I did not understand. I fell asleep in the chair by the fire and woke sometime after midnight, stiff and cold and disoriented. The fire had burned low again, and the room was full of shadows. I rose to add more coal to the grate, and as I did, I heard something. A sound from the corridor outside my door. Soft, rustling, like the whisper of silk against stone. I stood very still, my hand frozen over the coal scuttle, and I listened. The sound came again, closer now, and then stopped, just outside my door. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, slowly, as though moved by an invisible hand, a shadow darkened the crack of light beneath my door. Someone was standing there. Someone or something. I do not know where I found the courage, but I crossed the room and opened the door. The corridor was empty, but there, hanging from the handle of my door, was a dress, a gown of pale blue silk with delicate lace at the bodice. The same dress I had watched Simon burn to ashes only hours before. I touched it. The fabric was cold, colder than the air around it, and yet it was real, solid, whole. Not a single scorch mark, not a trace of ash. It hung there as though it had always been there, as though it belonged there, as though it were waiting for me. I do not remember returning to my room. I do not remember closing the door, or sinking into the chair, or pulling a blanket around my shoulders. I only remember staring at the wall, my mind a blank white page of shock, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains and the household began to stir around me. The dress was still there when I opened the door again, still blue, still cold, still impossible. And I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like winter frost, that whatever had happened in this house, whatever had happened to Isabel Hale, was not yet finished. The dead do not burn their own belongings. The dead do not weep into flames. But perhaps, sometimes, the dead do not stay buried. Perhaps sometimes they return. I took the dress into my room and hid it in the bottom of my wardrobe, beneath layers of petticoats and shawls. I did not know what else to do. I did not know who to tell or how to explain what I had seen. I only knew that I could not leave it hanging there, a silent accusation, a message I could not yet read. That morning, when I came down to breakfast, Simon looked at me with something that might have been concern. "You look pale," he said. "Are you unwell?" I told him I had slept badly, nothing more, and he accepted the explanation without question. We ate in silence, as we always did, and I studied his face for any sign that he knew what had happened, that he had seen the dress, that he understood. But there was nothing. Only that same careful courtesy, that same distant politeness, that same grief buried just beneath the surface of his gray eyes. I had married a man with secrets. I had come to a house with ghosts, whether of memory or something more I could not yet say. And somewhere in the west wing, behind a closed door, the rooms of Isabel Hale waited in darkness, holding their silence, keeping their dead. I was Lady Hale now. This was my home. And whatever haunted these halls, I would have to find the courage to face it. Not for Simon's sake, not yet, but for my own. Because I had spent too many years being small and quiet and afraid, and I was tired, so very tired, of living in other people's shadows. Even if this shadow belonged to a ghost. The days that followed were a study in the art of pretending. I moved through Thornbury Hall as though nothing had changed, as though I had not hidden a ghost's gown in my wardrobe, as though my sleep was not haunted by the image of blue silk emerging whole from ash and flame. I smiled at Mrs. Pemberton and approved the weekly menus. I took tea in the drawing room and wrote letters to my aunt that said nothing of consequence. I dined with my husband at opposite ends of that impossibly long table and made conversation about the weather and the estate accounts and the tenant farmers who would need new roofing before spring. I was the perfect new wife, composed and capable and utterly, terrifyingly alone with a secret I could not speak. Simon noticed nothing, or perhaps he noticed and chose not to ask. There was a distance between us that seemed to grow wider with each passing day, a careful choreography of avoidance that we both performed without ever acknowledging it. He spent his mornings in his study, his afternoons walking the estate, his evenings in the library with a glass of brandy and books I never saw him read. We occupied the same house, but lived in separate worlds, two planets in the same cold orbit, never quite touching. I told myself this was to be expected. We were still strangers after all. These things took time. But late at night, when I lay awake listening to the house settle and creak around me, I wondered if time would ever be enough. I wondered if Simon would ever look at me and see me, truly see me. Or if I would always be a pale reflection, a substitute, a living woman standing in the shadow of a dead one. On the 5th day after the dress appeared, I made a decision. I could not continue like this, suspended between fear and ignorance, haunted by questions I was too afraid to ask. If Isabel's spirit walked these halls, if some part of her lingered still in this world, then I needed to understand why. I needed to know who she had been, what had happened to her, and what she wanted from me, because the dress had been left on my door, not Simon's, mine. Whatever message the dead were trying to send, it was meant for me. I began my investigation in the most obvious place, the library. Thornbury Hall possessed an impressive collection of books accumulated over generations, shelves upon shelves of leather-bound volumes on every subject from agriculture to philosophy. But I was not interested in the scholarly tomes. I was looking for something more personal, more revealing. I was looking for traces of Isabel. I found them in a small writing desk tucked into an alcove near the window. The desk had clearly belonged to a woman, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl, its drawers lined with faded rose paper. Inside, I discovered a collection of correspondence, letters written in a delicate feminine hand and tied with ribbon, as well as a small leather journal with gold-edged pages. My hands trembled as I lifted the journal. I knew I was trespassing on sacred ground, reading words never meant for my eyes, but I had been given a dress that should not exist. And I had to believe, that this gave me some right to seek answers. The journal was Isabel's. Her name was inscribed on the first page in that same delicate script, Isabel Whitmore Hale, and below it, a date, March 1868. 3 years before I had ever heard the name Hale spoken in my presence. I read. The entries were sporadic at first. Brief notes about the weather and social engagements, the ordinary chronicle of a young wife settling into her new life. Isabel wrote of her love for Thornbury, for its gardens and its wild moorland views, for the way the light fell through the conservatory glass in the late afternoon. She wrote of Simon with a tenderness that made my chest ache, his kindness, his patience, the way he laughed when they were alone together, a laugh she said he reserved only for her. She wrote of her hopes for the future, for the family they would build, for the long, happy years that stretched before them, like a golden road. But as the months passed, the entries changed. The first hints were subtle. A mention of headaches that would not fade. A note about feeling watched in the West Wing corridor. A dream of standing in a room filled with flowers, all of them dead, while someone whispered her name from behind a closed door. Isabel dismissed these as nerves, as the natural anxieties of a new bride still adjusting to her role. But the frequency of such entries increased, and the dismissals grew less convincing. By the 2nd year of her marriage, Isabel was writing of things she could not explain. Objects moved from where she had left them. Candles extinguished themselves in rooms with no draft. She heard footsteps in empty corridors and music playing from the locked music room in the dead of night. And she saw things, shadows in mirrors that did not match her own reflection. A figure standing at the foot of her bed that vanished when she lit a candle. A woman's face at the window of the conservatory, pale and watching, gone between one blink and the next. She told Simon. Of course she told him. But the entries that followed those conversations were full of frustration and hurt. He does not believe me, she wrote. He thinks I am unwell, that my nerves are overwrought, that I need rest and fresh air, and perhaps a tonic from Dr. Ellis. He looks at me with such concern, such pity, and I cannot bear it. I am not mad. I know what I have seen. Something is in this house. Something that was here before I came and will be here long after I am gone. I feel it watching me. I feel it waiting. I closed the journal. My hands were shaking, and there were tears on my cheeks that I did not remember shedding. Poor Isabel. Poor, frightened, disbelieved Isabel. She had experienced the same things I was beginning to experience, and no one had listened. No one had helped her. She had faced whatever haunted Thornbury Hall entirely alone. But wait. If Isabel had seen a ghost, if Isabel had been haunted by some presence in this house, then the presence could not have been Isabel herself. The haunting had begun before her death, which meant there was another ghost, an older ghost, a spirit that had tormented the First Lady Hale, and now perhaps was reaching out to the second. Or did it? Could it be that the haunting Isabel described and the haunting I was experiencing were different things entirely? Could Isabel have become, in death, the very thing she had feared in life, another ghost added to the house's collection of sorrows? My head ached with questions I could not answer. I needed more information. I needed to understand the history of this house, the secrets it kept, the dead who might still walk its halls. But I could not ask Simon, not yet. Not until I had something more concrete than a journal full of frightened speculation and a dress that should have been ash. I returned the journal to the desk and spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring the library's shelves, searching for anything that might illuminate Thornbury Hall's past. I found a family history commissioned by Simon's grandfather, a dry genealogical account that traced the Hale lineage back to the 16th century. I found architectural plans showing the various additions and renovations made over the years, and I found, tucked behind a row of books on animal husbandry, a slim volume bound in black leather with no title on its spine. The book was a record of deaths, not a formal parish register, but a private accounting, maintained by successive generations of the Hale family, of every person who had died within the walls of Thornbury Hall. The entries were terse, name and date and cause of death, nothing more. But as I turned the pages, a pattern began to emerge. The deaths were not unusual in themselves. Old age, illness, accidents, the ordinary catalogue of mortality that any ancient house might accumulate over centuries. But there were 3 deaths, all of women, all relatively young, that caught my attention. The first was Margaret Hale, who died in 1743 at the age of 28, cause listed simply as melancholia. The second was Catherine Hale, who died in 1801 at the age of 31, cause listed as fever. And the third was Isabel Hale, who died in 1869 at the age of 26, cause listed as sudden illness. 3 young wives, 3 deaths in the same house, 3 women who had come to Thornbury as brides and never left. I felt cold, suddenly, despite the fire crackling in the library grate. I thought of the dress hanging on my door, of the face Isabel had seen at the conservatory window, of the footsteps in empty corridors and the music from locked rooms. I thought of the way Simon had wept as he burned that blue silk gown, the way he carried grief like a stone around his neck, the way he could not quite meet my eyes. What had happened to these women? What happened to the wives of Thornbury Hall? I did not realize I had spoken aloud until a voice answered me from the doorway. They say the house takes them. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing at the library entrance was a woman I had not seen before, elderly and elegant, dressed in severe black silk with a cameo at her throat, and silver hair swept into an immaculate coiffure. Her face was lined but handsome, with sharp cheekbones and eyes of a pale, piercing blue that seemed to see straight through me. "Forgive me," she said, stepping into the room with the assured grace of someone who belonged there. "I did not mean to startle you. I am Honoria Cotfield, Simon's aunt. You must be the new Lady Hale." I curtsied, flustered and embarrassed, the Book of Deaths still clutched in my hands. Lady Cotfield. I had heard the name mentioned by Mrs. Pemberton, Simon's only living relative on his mother's side, a dowager who kept a house in London and rarely visited Yorkshire. I had not expected to meet her so soon. I had not expected to meet her at all. Lady Cotfield crossed the room and seated herself in one of the leather armchairs near the fire, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance. She gestured for me to sit as well, and I obeyed, feeling very much like a schoolgirl called before a headmistress. "I see you have found the death book," she said, her eyes flicking to the volume in my lap. "Looking for Isabel, were you?" I did not know how to answer. The truth seemed dangerous, but a lie would be worse. "I have been trying to understand this house," I said finally. "Its history, its people." Lady Cotfield smiled. But there was no warmth in it. A diplomatic answer. "You are cleverer than I expected. Simon described you as a sensible woman, practical and unimaginative. I see now that he was mistaken, or perhaps misled." I did not know whether to be offended or intrigued. I chose the latter. "What did you mean," I asked, "when you said the house takes them?" Lady Cotfield was silent for a long moment, studying me with those pale, penetrating eyes. Then she sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "There are stories," she said, "old stories, passed down through the Hale women, never spoken of to the men. Stories of a presence in this house, something that has been here since the beginning, something that attaches itself to the brides who come to Thornbury." She paused, her gaze drifting to the fire. "My own mother told me these stories when I was a girl. I thought them nonsense, the superstitions of an earlier age. But then I watched my nephew marry Isabel Whitmore, and I watched that girl change. I watched the light go out of her eyes, watched her grow pale and fearful, watched her speak of things she saw and heard that no one else could perceive. And then I watched her die, and I wondered if the stories were nonsense after all. I felt the cold again, deeper this time, settling into my bones." "And you think," I said slowly, "that whatever happened to Isabel, whatever haunted her, might happen to me?" Lady Cotfield's eyes met mine. "I think," she said, "that you are already beginning to see. Am I wrong?" I thought of the dress. I thought of the shadow beneath my door. I thought of the certainty I had felt, standing in that dark corridor, that I was not alone. "No," I whispered, "you are not wrong." Lady Cotfield nodded, as though I had confirmed something she already knew. "Then you have a choice," she said. "You can leave, return to London, seek an annulment, invent some scandal to free yourself. Simon would not fight you. He might even be relieved. And the other choice? The other choice is to stay, to face whatever is in this house, to try to understand it, perhaps even to end it." Lady Cotfield leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. "Isabel tried, you know. Near the end, she became convinced that the haunting had a purpose, that the spirits were trying to tell her something. She sought help from someone in London, a woman who claimed to speak with the dead. I do not know what she learned, but something changed in those final weeks. She seemed almost peaceful, almost hopeful. And then she died, and whatever she had discovered died with her. I stared at the old woman, my mind racing. A medium. Isabel had consulted a medium, and whatever she had learned had given her hope, even if that hope had come too late. "Who was she?" I asked. "The woman Isabel consulted?" Lady Cotfield rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. "Her name is Madame Lenoir. She keeps rooms in Mayfair and receives visitors by appointment only. Whether she is a charlatan or something more, I cannot say. But if you are determined to understand what haunts this house, she may be the only one who can help you." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at me. "One more thing, Lady Hale. Simon knows nothing of the old stories. His mother died before she could tell him, and I never saw fit to burden him with tales I did not believe. Whatever you discover, whatever you choose to do, you must decide for yourself whether to share it with him. But I would counsel caution. He loved Isabel very deeply. The truth of what happened to her might destroy him. And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the library with the fire dying in the grate and 1,000 questions burning in my mind. That night, I dreamed again. I was standing in the conservatory, the same place where Simon had burned the dress, but now it was filled with flowers, roses and lilies, and orchids cascading from every surface, their perfume so thick I could barely breathe. At the center of the room stood a woman with her back to me, her pale hair loose around her shoulders, her gown the color of a summer sky. "Isabel," I said, though I did not know how I knew her name. She turned. Her face was beautiful, delicate and sad, with eyes the color of winter twilight. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she spoke. "Find the letter," she said. Her voice was soft, like wind through dry leaves. "Find the letter, and you will understand." "What letter?" I asked. "Where?" But she was already fading, dissolving like mist in morning sun, and the flowers around me began to wilt and blacken, petals falling like dark snow. I woke with her words echoing in my ears. "Find the letter, and you will understand." I did not know what letter she meant. I did not know where to look, but I knew, with a certainty that burned in my chest like a coal, that Isabel had spoken to me. The ghost of the First Lady Hale had reached across the veil between living and dead, and she had given me a task. I would not fail her. The next morning, I wrote a letter of my own. I addressed it to Madame Lenoir, Mayfair, London, and I asked, as politely and formally as I could, for an appointment at her earliest convenience. I told her that I was the new Lady Hale of Thornbury Hall, that I had reason to believe my home was haunted, and that I sought her guidance in understanding and resolving the spirits that lingered there. I sealed the letter and gave it to the footman to post. Then I went to the conservatory, to the place where Simon had burned the dress, and I knelt on the cold stone floor and I spoke to the empty air. "I heard you," I said. "I will find the letter. I will understand. And if there is something you need, something that keeps you here, I will try to give it to you. I am not afraid of you, Isabel. I am only sorry that no one listened when you were alive." The air around me seemed to shift, to warm, just for a moment, and then it was still again, and I was alone, and the only sound was the distant ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the house. I rose and dusted off my skirts. I had work to do. Madame Lenoir's reply arrived on a Thursday, carried by the morning post, along with invitations and bills and the ordinary correspondence of a great house. I recognized it immediately by the unfamiliar hand and the faint scent of violets that clung to the paper, and I tucked it into my sleeve before anyone could see, my heart beating fast against my ribs. I did not open it until I was alone in my chambers, the door locked, the curtains drawn against the pale winter light. The letter was brief but warm, written in a flowing script that seemed to dance across the page. Madame Lenoir remembered Isabel Hale. She had wondered, she wrote, if the new Lady Hale might one day seek her out. She would be honored to receive me at her rooms in Mayfair any afternoon I chose, and she enclosed her card with the address written in gilt ink. I held the card in my hands and felt something shift inside me, some door opening onto a path I could not yet see. This was real. I was going to do this. I was going to travel to London, to consult a woman who spoke with the dead, to seek answers to questions that defied all reason and logic. The sensible Eleanor Ashford I had once been would have laughed at such foolishness, but I was not Eleanor Ashford anymore. I was Eleanor Hale, and Thornbury Hall had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The difficulty, of course, was Simon. We had settled into a routine by then, my husband and I, a careful dance of coexistence that allowed us to share a house without ever truly sharing our lives. He did not ask what I did with my days, and I did not ask what weighed so heavily on his mind. We were polite, we were cordial, we were utterly, achingly distant. And yet, I could not simply announce that I was going to London to visit a spiritualist without inviting questions I was not prepared to answer. In the end, I chose the simplest lie. I told Simon over breakfast that I wished to visit my aunt in London, that it had been too long since I had seen her, that a few days in town would do me good. He looked up from his newspaper with something that might have been surprise or might have been relief, and said, of course, I should go. He would have the carriage prepared. It was that easy. He did not ask when I would return. He did not offer to accompany me. He simply nodded and returned to his reading, and I felt a pang of something that was not quite hurt and not quite anger, but something in between. Did he care so little? Or did he care so much that he could not bear to show it? I pushed the thought aside. I had more pressing concerns than my husband's indifference. The journey to London took most of a day, the train rattling through grey landscapes of field and village and industrial town, smoke rising from distant chimneys like signals from another world. I watched the countryside pass and thought about Isabel, about the journal entries I had read and reread until I knew them almost by heart, about the fear that had grown in her like a vine until it had choked the life from her completely. Had she made this same journey, I wondered? Had she sat in a compartment much like this one, watching the world blur past, hoping that a woman in Mayfair might hold the answers she so desperately sought. I arrived in London as evening fell, the city lighting up around me like a vast constellation of gas lamps and carriage lanterns and windows glowing with warm domestic light. I took a hansom cab to a modest hotel where I had arranged to stay, unpacked my small valise, and spent a restless night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, so different from the deep silence of Thornbury Hall. The next afternoon, I presented myself at Madame Lenoir's address. The house was a narrow Georgian townhouse in a quiet corner of Mayfair, its facade painted a dignified cream, its windows hung with velvet curtains that revealed nothing of the interior. A maid answered my knock and led me up a narrow staircase to a sitting room on the first floor where Madame Lenoir waited. She was not what I had expected. I had imagined someone theatrical, draped in scarves and jewelry, with wild eyes and a dramatic manner. Instead, I found a woman of perhaps 50, elegantly dressed in dove-gray silk, with dark hair streaked with silver and a face that was handsome rather than beautiful, marked by intelligence and quiet strength. Her eyes, when they met mine, were the deep brown of polished wood, and they held a warmth that put me immediately at ease. "Lady Hale," she said, rising to greet me. Her accent was faintly French, a melodic lilt beneath her precise English. "I am so glad you have come. Please, sit. Marie will bring us tea." I sat in the chair she indicated, a comfortable armchair upholstered in burgundy velvet, and looked around the room. It was not the dim, incense-filled chamber I had imagined. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the furniture was tasteful and well-made, and the afternoon light streamed through the windows, illuminating a space that felt more like a scholar's study than a fortune-teller's parlor. "You are surprised," Madame Lenoir said, reading my expression with unnerving accuracy. "You expected crystal balls and Ouija boards, perhaps." She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "I am afraid I must disappoint you. The spirits do not require such theatrics. They speak to those who are willing to listen, nothing more." The maid returned with tea, and Madame Lenoir poured with the practiced grace of a society hostess. When we were alone again, she set down her cup and regarded me with those warm, penetrating eyes. "You wrote that you believe Thornbury Hall is haunted," she said. "Tell me what you have experienced." I told her everything, the dress that had appeared on my door after Simon burned it, the shadows I had seen, the cold I had felt, the certainty of a presence watching me in the dark. I told her about Isabel's journal, about the hauntings she had described, about the fear that had consumed her, and I told her about the dream, about Isabel standing among the dying flowers, about the words she had spoken. "Find the letter, and you will understand." Madame Lenoir listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful and grave. When I had finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Isabel came to me 3 times, she said finally. The first time, she was frightened and confused. She had experienced things she could not explain, and her husband, though loving, could not help her. He did not believe in spirits. He thought her nerves were fragile, her imagination overactive. She came to me seeking validation, and I gave her what I could. I told her that the spirits she sensed were real, that she was not mad, that her perceptions were a gift, not a curse. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. The second time she came, she was calmer. She had accepted what she was experiencing, and she wanted to understand it. We held a séance together, just the 2 of us, and we made contact with the presence in Thornbury Hall. My breath caught. "What did you learn?" Madame Lenoir looked at me steadily. "The spirit is old," she said, "very old. It has been in that house since the 17th century, bound there by grief and guilt, and a wrong that was never righted. It attaches itself to the women who come to Thornbury as brides because it was once a bride itself, a woman who died before her time, whose story was buried and forgotten. It does not mean harm. It seeks only to be heard, to be remembered, to have its truth finally told. "A woman," I whispered. Who was she? Her name was Eleanor. The room seemed to tilt around me. Eleanor. My name. The ghost that haunted Thornbury Hall shared my name. Madame Lenoir nodded, seeing my shock. Yes, Eleanor Hale, the first bride of the first Lord Hale, who built Thornbury Hall in 1672. She died within a year of her marriage, and the official record says she perished of childbed fever. But the truth that Isabel discovered and that the spirit itself revealed to us, is far darker. "Tell me," I said. "I need to know." Madame Lenoir rose and went to a cabinet in the corner of the room. She withdrew a small wooden box and brought it back to her chair, setting it on the table between us. "Eleanor Hale did not die of fever," she said. "She was murdered by her husband." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "Lord Hale was a jealous man," Madame Lenoir continued, her voice soft but steady. "He believed, wrongly, that his wife had been unfaithful. There were rumors, whispers, a letter that someone placed in his hands, a letter that accused Eleanor of carrying another man's child. The letter was a lie, a forgery created by a rival who coveted Eleanor for himself. But Lord Hale believed it. He confronted his wife. She denied the accusations, but he would not listen. In a rage he struck her, and she fell, and she did not rise again. I pressed my hand to my mouth, tears burning in my eyes. That poor woman, that poor, innocent woman. Lord Hale covered up the crime, Madame Lenoir said. He claimed his wife had died in childbirth, though she had never been with child at all. He destroyed the letter that had driven him to murder, or so he believed. But Eleanor had hidden the original, the true letter she had written to her sister, confessing her fears about her husband's jealousy, the letter that would have proven her innocence. She hid it somewhere in Thornbury Hall, hoping it would one day be found, hoping the truth would one day come to light. And when she died, her spirit remained, trapped by the injustice of her death, waiting for someone to find the letter and clear her name. "The letter," I breathed. "That is what Isabel meant. The letter Eleanor hid. The letter that proves she was innocent." Madame Lenoir opened the wooden box and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "This is the forgery," she said. "The false letter that Lord Hale believed. Isabel found it hidden in the estate records, tucked between pages in an old account book. She brought it to me on her third and final visit, just weeks before she died. But she never found the real letter, Eleanor's letter, the one that would reveal the full truth. She held the forgery out to me, and I took it with trembling hands. The handwriting was old-fashioned and difficult to read, but the accusations were clear enough. Adultery, betrayal, a child that was not her husband's, all lies, all vicious, calculated lies that had cost an innocent woman her life. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would Isabel's spirit appear to me? If the original haunting was Eleanor, why did I dream of Isabel?" "Because Isabel became part of it," Madame Lenoir said gently. "When she died, her spirit joined Eleanor's in that house. They are linked now, two women bound by the same tragedy, the same injustice, the same need to be heard. Isabel tried to solve the mystery and failed. Now she is reaching out to you, hoping you will succeed where she could not." I stared at the forged letter in my hands, my mind reeling. Two ghosts, two women, separated by centuries, united by the walls of Thornbury Hall and the secrets buried within them. And somehow, impossibly, I had been chosen to set them free. "What happened to Isabel?" I asked. "How did she really die?" Madame Lenoir's expression grew sad. "I do not know," she said. "When she left me after her third visit, she was determined to find Eleanor's letter. She believed she knew where to look, but 2 weeks later, I received word that she had died suddenly, of a fever." Her eyes met mine. I have never believed it was a fever. You think she was murdered too? I think, Madame Lenoir said carefully, that there are secrets in that house that someone wishes to remain buried. I think Isabel got too close to the truth, and I think her death was not the natural passing that everyone believed. But I have no proof, only suspicion. Only the feeling, the certainty in my bones that her story is not yet finished. I left Madame Lenoir's rooms with the forged letter tucked into my reticule and a weight on my heart that seemed to press the very breath from my lungs. 2 murdered women, 2 spirits crying out for justice, and I, the third bride of Thornbury Hall, standing at the center of a mystery that spanned centuries. The train journey back to Yorkshire passed in a blur. I did not see the landscape this time, did not notice the stations or the passengers or the fading light. I saw only the faces of the dead, Eleanor and Isabel, 2 women I had never known in life, but who had become, in some strange way, my sisters in suffering. I would find the letter. I would uncover the truth. I would set them free or die trying. When the carriage from Thornbury Hall met me at the station, I was surprised to find Simon waiting inside. He looked tired, I noticed, tired and worried, with shadows beneath his eyes that had not been there when I left. He helped me into the carriage without speaking, and we sat in silence as the horses began the long drive home. Finally, he spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice low and strained. "While you were away, I have been thinking about us, about this marriage, about the way I have treated you." I turned to look at him, startled by this unexpected confession. "I have not been fair to you, Eleanor." He used my name, my real name, for the first time since our wedding day. "I married you because I was lonely and lost, and my aunt convinced me that a wife would help me heal. But I did not consider what it would mean for you, to come into a house still haunted by another woman's memory. I did not consider how it would feel, to be second, always second, to a ghost you never knew." "Simon," I began, but he held up his hand. "Let me finish, please." He took a breath, steadying himself. "Isabel was the love of my youth. I will not pretend otherwise. When she died, I thought I would never feel anything again. I thought my heart had died with her. But these past weeks, watching you move through this house, watching you try so hard to make a place for yourself, I have felt something stirring, something I thought was gone forever." He turned to face me, and in the dim light of the carriage, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. "I do not know if I can love you the way I loved her," he said. "I do not know if I am capable of that kind of love anymore. But I would like to try, if you will let me. If you can forgive me for being so cold, so distant, so lost in my own grief that I could not see the woman standing right in front of me." I reached across the space between us and took his hand. It was warm in mine, warm and solid and real, and I felt something break loose in my chest, some knot of loneliness and fear that had been tightening for longer than I could remember. "I do not need you to love me the way you loved her," I said. "I only need you to see me, to try. That is enough, Simon. That is more than enough." He lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture so tender, so unexpected, that I felt tears spill down my own cheeks. "Then I will try," he said. "I promise you, Eleanor. I will try." We rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than before. It was the silence of 2 people who had finally, tentatively, begun to find their way toward each other. It was the silence of hope. But even as I leaned into that hope, even as I allowed myself to imagine a future where Simon and I might build something real and lasting, I could not forget what I had learned in London. I could not forget the forged letter in my reticule, the murdered brides, the spirits waiting for justice. I would find Eleanor's letter. I would uncover the truth about Isabel's death. And I would do it, not just for the ghosts who haunted Thornbury Hall, but for myself, for my marriage, for the man who had just promised to try to love me. Some secrets, once unearthed, cannot be buried again. I could only hope that the truth, when it came, would set us all free rather than destroy us. The carriage wheels turned on through the gathering dark, carrying us home to a house full of shadows, and I pressed my hand against the place where the forged letter lay hidden, and I thought of Eleanor, the first bride, the murdered wife, the ghost who shared my name. "I am coming," I whispered, too softly for Simon to hear. "I will find your letter. I will tell your story. I promise." And somewhere in the darkness ahead, I could have sworn I heard an answer, soft as a sigh, grateful as a prayer. "Thank you." The days that followed my return from London were unlike any I had known since coming to Thornbury Hall. Something had shifted between Simon and me. Some invisible wall had crumbled, and in its place grew the first tender shoots of something that might, in time, become love. He began to seek out my company, joining me for morning walks in the frost-touched gardens, sitting with me in the evenings by the library fire, asking about my thoughts and listening, truly listening, to my answers. We spoke of books and music and memories from our separate childhoods. We discovered shared passions for poetry and thunderstorms and the particular golden light that falls across the moors at sunset. And slowly, tentatively, I began to believe that I might belong here after all. But even as my heart opened to my husband, my mind remained fixed on the mystery that haunted our home. I had not told Simon what I had learned in London. I had not shown him the forged letter or spoken of murdered brides or vengeful spirits. Madame Lenoir had counseled caution, and I heeded her warning. Simon's love for Isabel had been deep and true. To suggest that her death was not what it seemed, that she had been killed for getting too close to a centuries-old secret, might shatter him completely. I needed proof first. I needed the letter. I began my search in the most logical place, Isabel's journal. I had read it once before, looking for evidence of hauntings, but now I read it again with different eyes, searching for any hint of where she might have looked for Eleanor's hidden letter, any clue that might lead me to the truth. The entries from her final weeks were different from the others. The fear that had dominated her earlier writing had given way to something else, a calm determination, an almost feverish excitement. "I am close," she wrote in an entry dated just 10 days before her death. I know now where she hid it. The answer was in the music room all along, in the songs she used to play, in the keys that never quite sounded right. "Tomorrow I will open the piano and find what has been waiting there for 200 years. Tomorrow I will set her free. The music room. The piano." I felt my pulse quicken as I read the words. Isabel had found it. She had known where the letter was hidden. But she had died before she could retrieve it, or perhaps a darker thought whispered, because she had retrieved it. I went to the music room that very afternoon, slipping away while Simon was occupied with estate business and the servants were busy with their duties. The room was on the ground floor of the west wing, an elegant space with tall windows overlooking the garden, walls papered in faded gold damask, and at its center, a beautiful grand piano of dark polished wood. The piano was old, I realized as I approached it. Very old. The style was not Victorian, but something earlier, something that might have been here since the house was built. I ran my fingers over the keys, pressing them one by one, listening to the notes ring out in the empty room. Most sounded clear and true, but there, in the upper register, 3 keys that produced a dull, muffled tone, as though something was blocking the strings inside. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid of the piano and looked within. The interior was dusty and draped with cobwebs, clearly untouched for years. I peered into the darkness, trying to see where the 3 muffled keys connected to their hammers, and there, wedged between the strings and the wooden frame, I saw it. A small packet wrapped in oilcloth, yellowed with age but still intact. I reached in, my fingers brushing against 2 centuries of accumulated dust, and drew the packet out into the light. Inside was a letter. The paper was brittle and brown at the edges, the ink faded to a pale sepia, but the words were still legible. The handwriting was different from the forgery I carried in my reticule. More fluid, more feminine, more desperate. I began to read. My dearest sister, the letter began. I write to you in fear for my life, and I beg you, if this letter ever reaches your hands, to know that whatever my husband may say of me after I am gone, it is lies, all lies. The letter went on to describe the first Eleanor's marriage, happy at first, then poisoned by jealousy and suspicion. She wrote of her husband's rages, his accusations, his conviction that she had been unfaithful with a man she barely knew. She wrote of a letter he had received, a letter that claimed she carried another man's child, and of her desperate attempts to convince him of her innocence. I have never been untrue to him, she wrote. I have never so much as looked at another man with desire, but he will not hear me. He looks at me now with such hatred, such cold fury, and I am afraid, sister. I am so afraid of what he might do. The final paragraph was the most heartbreaking of all. If I die, she wrote, know that I did not die of illness or accident. Know that my husband killed me, as surely as if he had put a knife to my throat, and know that I loved him even at the end. That is the cruelest part. I loved him, and he destroyed me for a sin I never committed. Pray for me, sister. Pray that someone, someday, will find this letter and know the truth. Pray that my spirit will find peace at last. The letter was signed simply, Your Eleanor. I sat on the piano bench with tears streaming down my face, the letter clutched in my hands, and I wept for a woman I had never known, a woman who had died 200 years before I was born, a woman whose name I shared and whose tragedy I now held in my trembling fingers. I had found it. The proof of Eleanor's innocence. The truth that had been hidden for centuries, waiting for someone to uncover it. But what was I to do with it now? Before I could decide, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. I stuffed the letter into my sleeve, wiped my eyes, and tried to compose myself, but I was not quick enough. The door opened, and Mrs. Pemberton stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. "Lady Hale," she said, her voice strained. "I thought I heard the piano." "I was just looking at it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It is a beautiful instrument, very old. Mrs. Pemberton's gaze swept the room, taking in the open lid of the piano, the disturbed dust, my tear-stained cheeks. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then slowly, she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "You found it," she said. It was not a question. "You found the letter." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "How do you know about the letter?" Mrs. Pemberton crossed to the window and stood there with her back to me, looking out at the garden. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with weariness and something else, something that sounded almost like relief. "I have been housekeeper at Thornbury Hall for 30 years, she said. "I came here as a young woman, full of ambition and pride, determined to rise in service and make something of myself. And I succeeded. I became indispensable to this household, trusted with its secrets, its finances, its most private affairs." She paused, her shoulders tensing. "But some secrets are too heavy to carry alone." She turned to face me, and I saw that there were tears in her eyes too. "I knew about the first Eleanor," she said. "The story has been passed down among the housekeepers of Thornbury for generations, a warning and a burden. We knew that she was murdered, that her husband covered up the crime, that her spirit lingered in this house, waiting for justice. We knew about the letter she hid, though no one had ever been able to find it. And we knew," she swallowed hard, "that anyone who got too close to the truth was in danger." "In danger from whom?" I asked, though a terrible suspicion was already forming in my mind. Mrs. Pemberton shook her head. "I do not know. I truly do not. There is something in this house, something older than any of us, something that protects its secrets with a jealousy that borders on madness. I have seen glimpses of it over the years. Shadows that move when they should not, cold spots that appear without cause, whispers in empty rooms. I thought it was just the ghost of Eleanor, restless and sorrowful. But now I wonder if there is something else, something darker, something that does not want the truth to come to light. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping to a whisper. Lady Isabel found the letter too, she said. She came to this room just as you did, and she found where it was hidden. I saw her leaving with something in her hands, something wrapped in old cloth. And 3 days later, she was dead. I felt the blood drain from my face. You think she was killed for finding it? I think, Mrs. Pemberton said slowly, that there are forces at work in this house that we do not understand. I think that Lady Isabel disturbed something that should have been left alone, and I think her eyes met mine with desperate intensity, that you are in terrible danger. For a moment I could not speak. The letter in my sleeve seemed to burn against my skin, a secret that had already cost 2 women their lives. Was I to be the third? But even as the fear rose in me, something else rose with it. Anger, defiance, a fierce burning determination that I had not known I possessed. No, I said, and my voice was steadier than I had expected. I will not be silenced. I will not be frightened into submission. Eleanor has waited 200 years for someone to tell her story. Isabel died trying to give her that justice. I will not let their sacrifices be in vain. Mrs. Pemberton looked at me with something that might have been admiration or might have been pity. You are braver than I, she said, but bravery alone may not be enough. Then I will need help, I said, and I looked at her steadily. Will you help me, Mrs. Pemberton? Will you help me end this, once and for all? She was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. I have carried this burden for too long, she said. Perhaps it is time to set it down. Tell me what you need, Lady Hale. I will do what I can. That evening, I made a decision. I would tell Simon everything. I found him in the library after dinner, sitting in his favorite chair with a glass of brandy untouched beside him, staring into the fire with an expression of deep contemplation. He looked up when I entered, and a smile crossed his face. A real smile, warm and genuine, that made my heart ache with tenderness. Eleanor, he said, come, sit with me. I sat in the chair across from him, and for a moment I simply looked at him, this man I had married, this man I was beginning to love, this man whose first wife had died for the very secret I now carried. How could I tell him? How could I shatter the fragile peace we had built? But I knew I had no choice. If we were to face this together, if we were to have any hope of surviving what was to come, there could be no more secrets between us. Simon, I said, and something in my voice made his smile fade. There is something I must tell you. Something about Isabel, something about this house. I told him everything. I told him about the dress that had appeared on my door. I told him about Isabel's journal and the hauntings she had experienced. I told him about Lady Caulfield and Madame Lenoir and the story of the first Eleanor Hale. And I told him about the letter I had found, the letter that proved Eleanor's innocence, the letter that Isabel had died trying to retrieve. He listened in silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, he sat for a long moment without speaking, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Isabel, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. You are saying that Isabel was murdered? I do not know for certain, I said gently, but I believe she may have been. I believe she found the letter, just as I did, and that something, someone, killed her to keep the secret buried. Simon rose abruptly and crossed to the window, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. I have spent 2 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, believing that my wife died of a fever, that it was natural, unavoidable, a tragedy, but nothing more. And now you tell me that she may have been murdered, that she died because of a secret hidden in my own house, that I failed to protect her. I went to him then, crossing the space between us and placing my hand on his arm. You did not fail her, I said. You did not know. How could you have known? He turned to face me, and I saw the anguish in his eyes, the guilt and the grief and the rage all tangled together. But I should have believed her, he said. When she told me she was seeing things, hearing things, I should have believed her instead of thinking she was unwell. I should have listened. I should have protected her. You loved her, I said. You did the best you could with what you understood. No one can ask more than that. He looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something softened. You are remarkable, he said quietly. Any other woman would have fled this house by now. Any other woman would have demanded an annulment and never looked back. But you stay, you investigate, you face horrors that would send most people screaming into the night. Why? I considered the question carefully before I answered. Because I believe in justice, I said. Because those women, Eleanor and Isabel, they deserve to have their stories told. And because, I hesitated, then pressed on, because this is my home now. You are my husband. Whatever darkness lurks in these walls, I would rather face it with you than run from it alone. Simon took my hands in his, and I saw tears glistening in his eyes. I do not deserve you, he said. Perhaps not, I said, and I smiled despite myself. But you have me nonetheless. He laughed then, a broken, surprised sound, and he pulled me into his arms and held me there, held me close, his heart beating against mine, his warmth surrounding me like a shield against all the cold and darkness of the world. We will face this together, he said into my hair. Whatever comes, we will face it together. I closed my eyes and let myself believe him. But even as I rested in his arms, even as I allowed myself this moment of peace, I felt it. A chill in the air, a presence watching, a whisper at the edge of hearing, too faint to make out the words, but unmistakably there. The ghosts of Thornbury Hall were listening, and the time for hiding was almost over. That night, I dreamed again of Isabel. She stood in the music room, her pale hair loose, her blue dress flowing around her like water. But this time, she was not alone. Beside her stood another woman, older, her features indistinct but somehow familiar, her gown the style of another century. Eleanor, I whispered, and the older ghost turned to face me. You have found the letter, she said, and her voice was like wind through autumn leaves, ancient and sad and full of longing. You know the truth. I know, I said, and I will tell it. I will make sure everyone knows what was done to you. Eleanor's ghost smiled, a smile of such profound relief that it made my heart ache. Thank you, she said, but there is more you must know. More that was hidden, even from me. Isabel stepped forward, her expression urgent. The forgery, she said. The letter that condemned Eleanor. We know now who wrote it. Who? I asked, my pulse quickening. Who forged the letter? The two ghosts exchanged a glance, and when Isabel spoke again, her voice was heavy with sorrow. It was a servant, she said, a woman who loved Lord Hale and was jealous of his bride. She forged the letter, planted it where he would find it, hoping that he would cast Eleanor aside and turn to her instead. She did not know that her jealousy would lead to murder. She did not know that her lies would echo through centuries. But that is not all, Eleanor said. The servant's bloodline continued. Generation after generation, they served in this house, passing down the secret, protecting the lie. They became the housekeepers of Thornbury Hall. I felt ice spread through my veins. Mrs. Pemberton, I whispered. The ghosts nodded in unison. She knows more than she has told you, Isabel said. She may not have killed me herself, but she knows who did. She has always known. I woke with a gasp, my heart pounding, my nightgown soaked with sweat. The room was dark and cold, and somewhere in the house, a clock struck 3. Mrs. Pemberton, the woman who had seemed so helpful, so willing to assist me. The woman whose ancestors had forged the letter that killed Eleanor. The woman who knew what had happened to Isabel. I had trusted her. And that trust, I now realized, might have been a terrible mistake. I lay awake until dawn, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling, planning my next move. I could not confront Mrs. Pemberton directly, not without knowing more, not without understanding the full extent of her involvement, but I could watch her. I could follow her. I could find out what else she was hiding. The game had changed. The hunt was on. And I would not rest until I had uncovered every last secret that Thornbury Hall concealed. I waited 3 days before making my move. 3 days of watching Mrs. Pemberton go about her duties with that same composed efficiency she had always displayed. 3 days of noting her routines, her habits, the hours she spent alone in her private sitting room, the letters she sent and received. Simon watched with me, his presence a steady comfort at my side, though I could see the toll this revelation had taken on him. The woman who had served his family for 3 decades, the woman he had trusted implicitly, might have played some role in his first wife's death. The betrayal cut deep. On the 4th day, opportunity presented itself. Mrs. Pemberton received a letter that morning that seemed to agitate her greatly. I saw her face pale as she read it, saw her hands tremble as she tucked it into her pocket. That afternoon, she announced that she had business in the village and would be gone for several hours. The moment her carriage disappeared down the drive, I went to her sitting room. It was a modest space, neat and orderly as I would have expected, with a small desk by the window and a narrow bed against the wall. I searched quickly but thoroughly, opening drawers, checking behind books, lifting the mattress to peer beneath. And there, in a locked box hidden at the back of her wardrobe, I found what I was looking for. Letters. Dozens of them, spanning years, all written in the same cramped hand. I did not have time to read them all, but I read enough. They were from Mrs. Pemberton's mother, the previous housekeeper, and from her grandmother before that. They told the story of the family's secret shame, the forged letter that had started everything, the generations of silence and complicity that had followed. And they told of something else, something that made my blood run cold. There was a man, a distant cousin of the Hale family, a man named Reginald Ashworth, who had long believed that he had a claim to Thornbury Hall. He had been corresponding with the Pemberton women for years, feeding their resentment, encouraging their silence, promising them rewards when he finally took possession of the estate. And he had been at Thornbury visiting as a guest on the very night that Isabel died. I heard the front door open and footsteps in the hall. I stuffed several of the most damning letters into my sleeve and fled Mrs. Pemberton's room, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone in the house could hear it. That evening, Simon and I sat together in his study, the letters spread before us on his desk, and we pieced together the terrible truth. Reginald Ashworth had wanted Thornbury Hall. He had cultivated Mrs. Pemberton and her family for years, using their guilt and resentment to turn them into his spies and accomplices. When Isabel began investigating the old haunting, when she found the letter that proved the first Eleanor's innocence, Ashworth had seen an opportunity. If the truth came out, if the centuries-old crime was exposed, it would create a scandal that might weaken Simon's claim to the estate. But if the truth was buried, if everyone who knew it was silenced, the secret would die forever. Isabel had not died of a fever. She had been poisoned. The letters made that clear enough, though they never stated it directly. A tonic, prepared by Mrs. Pemberton at Ashworth's instruction. A slow-acting poison that mimicked the symptoms of illness. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. Simon's face was ashen as he read the final letter. "My cousin," he said, his voice hollow. My own blood. He killed my wife. I took his hand and held it tightly. He will pay, I said. We will make sure of it. But first, we must be certain we have enough evidence. We must be certain he cannot escape justice. Before we could plan our next move, the door to the study burst open. Mrs. Pemberton stood there, her face contorted with rage and fear, and in her hand she held a small pistol. "You found them," she said, her voice shaking. "I knew you would. I knew from the moment you came to this house that you would destroy everything." Simon rose to his feet, putting himself between me and the gun. "Put that down, Margaret," he said, using her Christian name, his voice calm despite the danger. "This does not have to end in violence." "It ended in violence 200 years ago," Mrs. Pemberton spat. "When my ancestor wrote that letter, when Lord Hale killed his wife, when the lie became the foundation of everything. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I chose to be born into a family of murderers and conspirators?" She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I have spent my whole life serving this house, keeping its secrets, protecting the lie that my family created. And for what? For a promise that Ashworth would reward us when he finally took what he believed was his." She waved the pistol toward the letters on the desk. "He promised us money. He promised us freedom. He promised that once he had Thornbury, we would never have to serve anyone again. All we had to do was keep the secret. All we had to do was silence anyone who got too close." "You killed Isabel," I said, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "You poisoned her." Mrs. Pemberton's face crumpled. "I did not want to. She was kind to me. She was the only mistress of this house who ever treated me like a human being. But Ashworth insisted. He said she knew too much, that she would expose everything. He gave me the tonic and told me what to do." She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. I have relived that moment every night for 2 years. I have heard her voice in my dreams, asking me why, and I have never had an answer. "Then help us now," Simon said, his voice gentle despite everything. "Help us bring Ashworth to justice. Help us end this, once and for all." Mrs. Pemberton opened her eyes, and for a moment I saw a flicker of hope there, a desperate longing for redemption. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head. "It is too late for me," she said. "Too late for any of us. Ashworth is coming. I sent word to him when I found my room disturbed. He will be here before midnight, and he will finish what we started." She raised the pistol, pointing it directly at Simon's chest. "I am sorry, my lord. Truly I am. But I have no choice." "You always have a choice," I said, stepping forward despite Simon's attempt to hold me back. "You chose wrong once, with Isabel. But you can choose differently now. You can help us stop him." Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, the pistol wavering in her grip. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension and possibility. And then the room grew cold. It happened so quickly that none of us had time to react. The temperature dropped in an instant, our breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The candles flickered and nearly went out. And there, in the corner of the room, a shape began to form, pale and luminous, a woman in a blue silk gown. Isabel. She looked exactly as she had in my dreams, beautiful and sad, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Pemberton with an expression that held no anger, only sorrow. "Margaret," she said, and her voice was soft, like wind through winter branches. "You have carried this burden long enough." Mrs. Pemberton made a strangled sound, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers. "My lady," she whispered, "forgive me. Please, forgive me." Isabel's ghost glided forward, and as she moved, another shape appeared beside her, older, more faded, the spirit of the first Eleanor, the woman who had started all of this 2 centuries ago. "There has been enough suffering," Eleanor said, her ancient voice carrying the weight of generations. "Enough secrets, enough death. It is time for the truth to be spoken and the guilty to face justice." Mrs. Pemberton fell to her knees, sobbing. "I will tell everything," she gasped. "I will testify against Ashworth. I will confess my part in all of it. Only please, please, let me make amends." The two ghosts looked at each other, and something passed between them, some understanding beyond words. Then Isabel turned to Simon, and her expression softened with a love that death itself could not extinguish. "Simon," she said. "My dearest Simon, I never blamed you. I want you to know that. You gave me the happiest years of my life." Simon's eyes were bright with tears. "Isabel," he breathed, "I am so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have protected you." "You are protecting me now," she said, "by seeking justice, by refusing to let my death be meaningless." She turned to me then, and her smile was warm, welcoming, without a trace of jealousy or resentment. "And you, Eleanor, my sister in this house of sorrow. Thank you for finding the truth. Thank you for giving us peace." I could not speak. Tears streamed down my face as I looked at this woman who should have been my rival, this ghost who had every reason to resent me, and saw only kindness, only gratitude, only love. "Take care of him," Isabel said. "He deserves happiness. You both do." "I will," I managed to whisper. "I promise." The two ghosts began to fade, their forms growing translucent, their light dimming. But before they vanished entirely, Eleanor spoke one last time. "The letter," she said. "Read it aloud. Let the world know the truth. And then we can rest." They were gone. The room warmed, the candles steadied, and we were left alone with Mrs. Pemberton, still kneeling on the floor, her face buried in her hands. Simon moved first. He picked up the fallen pistol and set it aside, then knelt beside the weeping housekeeper. "Margaret," he said quietly, "you heard them. It is time to make this right." She nodded, unable to speak, and allowed him to help her to her feet. Reginald Ashworth arrived at Thornbury Hall just before midnight, expecting to find his conspiracy intact and his enemies silenced. Instead, he found the local constable waiting for him, along with a magistrate. Simon and myself, armed with the letters, the forged document, Eleanor's original testimony, and Mrs. Pemberton's full confession. The trial that followed was the scandal of the season. The newspapers called it the Thornbury haunting, and they were not entirely wrong. The story of two murdered brides, a centuries-old conspiracy, and the ghosts who had reached across death to demand justice captured the imagination of all England. Reginald Ashworth was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to hang. Mrs. Pemberton, whose testimony had been instrumental in securing his conviction, was given a lighter sentence, imprisonment rather than death, a mercy that Simon himself had requested. I visited her once, before she was taken away. She looked old, older than her years, the weight of her family's sins finally lifted, but leaving her hollowed out, empty. "I do not expect forgiveness," she said. "I do not deserve it." "Perhaps not," I replied, "but you have my gratitude for speaking the truth at last, for giving Isabel and Eleanor the justice they deserved." She looked at me then, and there was something in her eyes that might have been wonder. "You are not like the others," she said, "the other brides of this house. You are stronger. Perhaps that is why you survived." I did not know how to answer that. I only knew that I had done what needed to be done, and that the ghosts of Thornbury Hall were finally at peace. The blue dress never appeared again. The cold spots vanished. The whispers ceased. The shadows behaved as shadows should. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as though a great weight had been lifted from its ancient stones. I walked through its corridors without fear, sat in the music room where Eleanor's letter had waited for 200 years, stood in the conservatory where Simon had burned Isabel's gown, and felt nothing but peace. Spring came early that year. The gardens, so long neglected, burst into bloom under the care of a new groundskeeper Simon had hired. I spent long afternoons walking the paths, planting roses, breathing in the scent of lavender and new growth. And Simon walked with me, his hand in mine, his eyes no longer shadowed by grief, but bright with something new, something that looked very much like hope. One evening, as we sat together in the library, he turned to me with an expression of such tenderness that my heart seemed to stop. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you told me that night, about facing the darkness together, about not running, even when every instinct screamed at you to flee." "I remember," I said. He took my hands in his grip warm and strong. "You saved me, Eleanor, not just from Ashworth or the conspiracy, but from myself, from the grief that was consuming me. You came into this house as a stranger, and you fought for justice, for truth, for the spirits of women you never knew. You are the bravest person I have ever met." "I am not brave," I said, my voice catching. I was terrified every moment. He smiled, that smile that had become so precious to me over these long months. "Bravery is not the absence of fear," he said. "It is acting despite it. And you, my darling Eleanor, acted when no one else would." He raised my hands to his lips and kissed them, first one, then the other. "I loved Isabel," he said softly. "I will not pretend otherwise. She was my first love, and a part of me will always belong to her. But she is at peace now, and I find that my heart, which I thought was closed forever, has opened again. It has opened for you." I could not speak. Tears were streaming down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a hope I had never dared to let myself feel. "I love you, Eleanor," Simon said, "not as a replacement for what I lost, but as something new, something precious in its own right. Will you let me love you? Will you let us build a life together, free from the shadows of the past?" "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, Simon. 1,000 times yes." He gathered me into his arms and held me there, held me close, and I felt something settle into place inside me, some broken piece finally made whole. We were married already, of course, bound by law and ceremony. But in that moment, in that quiet library filled with the light of a dying fire, we made a different kind of vow. A vow not of obligation, but of choice. A vow of love freely given and gratefully received. A vow that the darkness we had faced together had only made stronger. Thornbury Hall stands still, its grey stone weathered by centuries, its windows glinting in the Yorkshire sun. People come sometimes to see it, drawn by the stories, the legends, the tale of the haunted brides, and the ghosts who found their peace. I let them look. I let them wonder. The truth is more complicated than any story, more human than any legend. But that is all right. The truth belongs to us, to Simon and me, to Eleanor and Isabel, to all the women who lived and loved and suffered within these walls. I am Lady Hale now, not the second wife, not the replacement, but simply myself, Eleanor, mistress of this house, beloved of my husband, keeper of its secrets and its stories. I walk the corridors that once terrified me and feel only gratitude. I play the piano in the music room and think of the letter that waited so long to be found. I tend the roses in the garden and imagine Isabel walking beside me, her pale hair shining in the sunlight, her voice soft with approval. They are part of me now, these women I never knew. Eleanor, who died for a crime she did not commit. Isabel, who died seeking justice for a stranger. Their courage lives on in me. Their love lives on in this house. And their peace, hard-won and precious, lives on in every sunrise that breaks over the moors, every spring that brings new life to the gardens, every night that Simon and I spend in each other's arms, grateful for a second chance at happiness. This is my story, the story of a sensible woman who married a grieving man and found herself in the middle of a mystery 2 centuries old. The story of ghosts who sought not vengeance, but vindication. The story of love that transcended death, and love that was born from the ashes of tragedy. I do not know what the future holds. No one does. But I know that I will face it without fear. I know that Simon will be beside me, and the spirits of this house will watch over us, grateful and at peace. And I know, deep in my heart, that the dress will never hang on my door again, that the whispers are silent, the shadows are still, and Thornbury Hall is finally, truly home.